Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to edit a default or existing query. That phrase that I just said probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense at this point, so for now let's put it on the back burner and just dive into our event post type work, and we will circle back to this topic organically. Okay, so in our previous lesson, we customized this upcoming events query to not only order them by their event date instead of their published on date, but we also learned how to hide or exclude events that took place in the past. So this area on our home page is looking good now, but you'll notice that if we click on this View All Events screen, this Archive screen, it could use a bit of our attention. Now, before we worry about the ordering of the events or excluding past events, let's first just begin by getting rid of this fake hard-coded static date. Right? We already did that on the home page, but now we need to be sure to do it in this archive template. So up in the address bar, we can see that this is the /events archive screen. So if we want to make changes to this template, let's jump into our text editor. And within our theme folder, let's jump into archive-event PHP. So here we can see the while loop begins. We've got a div with a class of event summary for each event. And right within that div, there's an A element or a link, and that is the date circle. So here we can see it's got the fake hard-coded March and 25. So there's no point in coding the dynamic date again when we could just go and copy and paste it from our homepage template. So right now, let's jump into front-page.php. Let's scroll down a bit to the upcoming events area. Here's the while loop, and here we see that same A element or link. So just copy from the beginning of the A tag to the end of the A tag, copy that into your clipboard, and then back in archive event, let's just replace this A element with our clipboard. Okay, so if we save that, cool, so now the archive screen has real dates. So now we can get to the actual point of this lesson. On this archive screen, the posts are still ordered by their published on or created date, right? And instead of that, we want to order them by the most rapidly approaching event date. Also, we want to hide or exclude events from the past. So in order to make those things happen, our first instinct might be to go into the template file for this screen, right? The archive event PHP. And right before this while loop begins, your instinct might be to create our own new custom query here, just like we did on the home page. And while technically that could get the job done, it would create a bit of extra work for us, and we'd have to jump through a few hoops in order to keep pagination working. So the main point for this lesson is I want to let you know that creating your own brand new custom queries is not always the right answer. What's the old saying about if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail? What I'm getting at here is that on this archive screen, there's no need for us to completely destroy the default query that WordPress is going to make on its own based on the current URL, right? This default query that WordPress is making is almost what we want. We do indeed want to archive for event posts. We just want to change and tweak that query in subtle ways. In contrast to that, back on our home page, we did indeed need to write brand new separate custom queries to pull in the events and blog posts because WordPress by default was not going to query for those things at all. So custom queries are the right tool for the job when you want to do something that isn't related to the default behavior of the current URL. But that is not the case on our events archive screen. You and I can work with this default URL-based query that's happening on this screen. We just need to sculpt it into shape or make a few subtle adjustments to it. Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to learn how to do in this lesson. The reason we would do this is it can result in us not needing to write as much code, and it also makes sure that pagination will work without any extra hassle. So in order to begin customizing this query, let's go back into our text editor, and we actually don't need to make any changes to this archive event PHP file. So let me just delete these empty lines and close out that file. Instead, we want to jump into our functions.php file. Down at the very bottom, let's add a new line, and let's add a new action. So add action. The name of the WordPress event that we want to hook onto is pre-get-posts. Okay, so that's the first argument. The second argument is the name of the function that we are going to create, that we want to call or run during this moment. So we can make up any name we want. Why don't we call it University Adjust Queries? Okay, so now WordPress will call this function at precisely the right moment. So we better go ahead and create a function with this name. So maybe right above this line, let's say function, and then the name of the function that we just made up. So University Adjust Queries. Okay, and right before WordPress sends its query off to the database, it will give our function the last word. It will give us a chance to adjust the query, hence the name of the event, pre-get-posts, right before we get the posts with the query. Now the cool part here is when WordPress calls our function, it's going to give it a reference to the WordPress query object. So let me show you what I mean. On this line of code, when we are defining our function, within these parentheses, let's add a parameter named $query. So this way, when WordPress calls our function and it passes along the WordPress query object, we can now manipulate that object within the body of our function. So check this out. Within our function, let's just target that query object. Let's look inside the object with --, and I can tell you that it has a method or function named set. And we need to give this set method 2 arguments. The first argument is the name of a query parameter that we want to change. So for example, remember the good old posts per page. So if we say posts per page, and then the second argument is the value that you want to use. So then if we say just 1 post per page, we wouldn't do this in the real world, but let's just save this as a quick experiment. And if I jump back to the website, you can see that now there's only 1 event per page, and then we can use pagination to go to the next set of results and the next set. However, this is not limited to just the events. If I click blog up in the header, we can see that the code we wrote is being applied universally to all queries. So we're just seeing 1 individual blog post, and then we have to use pagination, right? Because we said 1 per page. And it goes even beyond that. The code that we just wrote is so powerful that it even affects the back-end admin portion of our website. So if I click on posts, we only see 1 item per page. Or if I click on events, right, we only see 1. So this is obviously not what we want. That code that we just wrote is too universal. It's too powerful. We don't want to manipulate or customize every single query on our website. In this case, we just want to customize the query for the /events page, right? The events archive screen. So back in our code, what we want to do is wrap this within an if statement, and then create a condition that will only be true on the events archive screen. So let's go ahead and cut and paste this line of code into our clipboard. Okay, and let's write an if statement. Within the curly brackets or body of the if statement, you can go ahead and paste back in your clipboard. And now let's work on the condition within these parentheses. So first and foremost, we only want this code to run if we are on the front end of our website, right? We don't want to manipulate the query on the back end admin portion of our website. So within our if statement condition, we can just say if is admin, right? This function will return true if you're looking at the admin dashboard. And then right before that, we can say exclamation, which negates this, or is the opposite. So only if you're not in the admin will this return true. Okay, so that's a good start. If we save that, we can see that now our admin is back to normal. All of our events are visible on one page. And the front end of our website is still using that custom query. But it's still not just tied to events, right? If I click onto the blog section, it's still being applied. So back in our code, let's just add on another condition check. So after this is admin, let's add a space and say and is post type archive, and we're interested in the event archive. Okay, so only if we're on the front end and only if we're on the archive for event. So let's save that. Our blog is back to normal, right? It's showing multiple posts. But our events archive is still listening to our query manipulation. And just to play it safe, whenever I manipulate a default query, I always like to add on one more check in the if statement. So I say and if the query that is being passed into our function, so $query, and then I can look within it for a method named isMainQuery. So this way we never accidentally manipulate a custom query. This function will only evaluate to true if the query in question is the default URL-based query. Cool, so we've strung together 3 different conditional checks, and this is now a rock-solid piece of code. We can sleep at night knowing that this query manipulation will only run on our intended URL. Okay, now at this point, let's get back to the task at hand. We don't actually want to set posts per page to 1. I only did that as an extreme example. So let's remove those arguments. And now what we really want to do is order by the event date instead of the published or created on date. And after that, we also want to exclude any events in the past. Now in our previous lesson, we already spent the time to create that custom logic, right? So there's no sense in writing it from scratch again. So right now, let's go ahead and jump into our front page PHP file. And here's the first bit of real PHP code, right? This is our custom query. This is where we learned how to order by a custom field and then filter out events from the past. So we can use this code as our guide. We just need to manually set each of these parameters one by one. So for example, let's begin by sorting by the event date. So for example, the first parameter that I want to target is named metaKey. So back in our functions.php, we're beginning this line of code by looking inside the WordPress query object, calling its method named set. The first argument is the query parameter that we want to target. So remember, the first one is metaKey, and then the second argument is what you want to set it to. So back in our front page, remember we set that to equal event date. So back in functions.php, say event date. Okay, so this line of code is now complete. So right below that, we're going to need to set another parameter. So we begin with our query object, look inside it, and call the set method again. And then you just rinse and repeat that process, right? So back in front page, the next parameter that we want to target is order by. So set order by. And then for the second argument, I can't remember the exact value, so you can just jump back into front page, and we set it to meta value num. So you can either remember that or just copy and paste it. Okay, you get the idea. Let's go ahead and save our progress with just these 2 lines in place. And we can see that our events archive is now sorted by the event date, right? June, July, September. Except we want them to be ordered in the opposite direction, right? We want the most rapidly approaching event first. So back in our code, let's add another line. Start with the query object, call its set method again, and back in front page, you'll remember that we used order and set it to ascending instead of descending. So back in functions.php, set order to ascending. Cool, so now we've got the correct ordering. Now let's change gears a bit and filter out or exclude events that took place in the past. So back in our functions.php file, within our if statement, let's add another new line. Begin with our query object, call the set method, and the name of the query parameter that we are interested in is meta_query. If you forgot about this parameter, that's okay. You can always just jump back into front page PHP. And here we can see, remember, we used meta query to only give us posts where the event date is greater than or equal to today. Now there is no need to type out all of this code again. We can just copy and paste it. So we want the value of what meta-query has been set to. So let's place our cursor at the beginning of the word array here. And then we're going to end with this outer parenthesis, right? We want to be sure to have the parenthesis that closes this inner array, and then this outer parenthesis that closes the top level array. Okay, so let's copy that into our clipboard. And then back in functions.php, we're just going to set meta-query to equal whatever's in our clipboard. So comma, and then the second argument. We do not need quotes around it because it's an array, not a string of text. So go ahead and paste. And before we save this, we need to remember that we're referencing a variable named today, right? Only show us posts where the event date is greater than or equal to today's date. So if we're going to reference this variable, we need to define that variable within this function. So if we jump back into frontpage.php, up right above our custom query on this line, we see that we are creating that today variable. So let's just copy that into our clipboard, and then back in functions, maybe up here right before the first line where we are setting query parameters, you could just paste that in, right? So now this code down here makes sense. This variable will reference this value, today's date. As soon as we save that, now our front end doesn't show past events. Cool. Now before we bring this lesson to a close, why don't we jump back to the home page, and then let's go ahead and create another event just to make sure that our pages are working the way we want them to. So back in the admin, let me create a brand new event. Let's title it Winter Study Night. Paste in a bit of dummy text. Let's set the event date way out into the future. So maybe December 10th. And let's go ahead and save it. Okay, so back on our home page, oops, remember we only want our home page to show the two most rapidly approaching events. So let's fix that so it doesn't show all events on the home page. So back in front page PHP, remember posts per page, we set it to -1, and that will show all items. But that was just an experiment. So now let's set that back to 2 to only pull in the two most rapidly approaching events. Okay, perfect, July and September. But then if you click View All Events to go to the archive, that screen does indeed show all upcoming events. Perfect. So everything is working just right. Now in our next lesson, we will learn how to create a separate page entirely named Past Events. Should be a lot of fun. Let's keep it rolling, and I will see you then.